India has a political history that's extremely long and complex, and you can tell just by the range of years we're going to talk about in about the next hour, from somewhere around 7,000 BCE up to year zero, and then about 300 years beyond. So we're well over 7,000 years of history in the next hour or so. So we're going to break it down to the extreme highlights, just to make it manageable. India goes through several major empires over these thousands of years, from the beginning of their first cities all the way beyond year zero. So these are some of the major ones we'll talk about. In case you don't know, here's India in the world. India sticks out of the Asian mainland, sticking out of the southern end of it. And India is really interesting because it's often called the subcontinent, because it has its own kind of, like, not just specific geography, but its own specific weather patterns and its own specific climate that is very different from much of the rest of Asia. And I'll show you a more detailed map. Here's India as it was kind of known in the ancient world. The borders you see drawn today are from modern day countries that did not exist in the ancient world. So India, on this map, spreads well up into the north, up into what is today called Afghanistan. That was all ancient India. So that kind of all gets brought together within this Indian civilization we'll talk about tonight. And these countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and modern day India, are modern creations, really since World War II. So they aren't relevant at all for this class. So looking at Indian civilization in the ancient world is basically like erasing all those modern day borders. India has extremely important geography. Number one, it is surrounded on the north by giant mountain ranges. The Himalayan mountains to the north and the northeast have some of the highest peaks in the whole world, the highest elevations. So they get extremely cold, especially in the wintertime. There's a huge amount of snow. And there's another mountain range in this kind of northwestern area called the Hindu Kush Mountains that generally separates Indian civilization from the rest of mainland Asia and prevents a lot of invaders from coming into India, because those mountains are really tough to cross, even in a lot of ways today, even with our modern technology. So in the ancient world, it was extremely difficult to, say, move large armies from mainland Asia down into India and try to conquer the place. So Indian civilization is kind of permitted to grow up in isolation from potential outside enemies for quite a long time. Its earliest civilization will develop along the Indus River Valley, which is here on the kind of northwest. These are a series of rivers that come together with the Indus. Basically, snow that melts from the mountains flows southward down toward the Arabian Sea, and that's where the water empties into the ocean. Every year, the Indus Valley, the Indus River, overflows its banks when a massive snowfall starts to melt in the springtime. Water runs down the rivers, overflows its banks, and so fresh water gets deposited along the valley surrounding the river route. And that makes the soil extremely fertile and extremely easy to farm. So according to kind of game theory, as we've talked about it before, this place is really easy to farm. Therefore, the peoples who grow up in these areas, they can grow a lot of food abundantly in an extreme amount, much easier than anywhere else in the neighborhood. So they don't have to have as many of their workers be farmers, because the food just kind of pops up almost by itself without a whole lot of labor. So there's a lot of extra workers that you can throw into what we call specialized labor, and they can make roads and big buildings and religious monuments and weapons and all kinds of things. So they get going on advanced technology, and they can start conquering their neighbors and start building empires. Does that make sense? There's another river system to the east, the northeast, called the Ganges River system, which basically also flows out of the Himalayas, but runs a kind of easterly and then southern route and empties out to the Bay of Bengal. And you'll get other large cities that pop up along the Ganges. So the flow of the water on a yearly cyclical basis is like the centerpiece of Indian geography, at least in their beginnings. They also get another huge amount of fresh water deposited by monsoonal storms that sweep up out of the Indian Ocean and cross over the Indian subcontinent and just kind of sit there from about June until about November. Modern day, people who study the climate, who study the weather patterns, believe that the cold air from the mountains kind of sucks the warmer storms, pulls them up over the land, and kind of holds them there over the summertime. And then as the snow starts to return to the peaks, then the monsoonal kind of weather patterns are released back out into the ocean. So they tend to leave again, move away from the land in about November or so each year. So that's another huge amount of rainfall that they bring. If you ever been in a monsoon or seen a monsoon, it's extremely impressive and even dangerous. It's where you get like flash floods and whatnot out in desert areas. But it's another source of huge water deposit, just fresh water. So Indian farmland is super fertile compared to almost anywhere else in the world. They get these two different cycles of water deposit into the land. And Indian farmers will start growing 2 crops a year, 2 harvests of food. So they're literally growing at least twice as much food as really almost anyone else in the world. Does that make sense? It's all a result of their geography in their area and the kind of weather patterns that the geography creates. And the earliest cities, at least big cities, known today in human history, start off in northwestern India along the Indus River Valley. These are called Mohenjo-daro and then Harappa a little bit further north. These cities seem to pop up around 3500 BCE. And they were just, the remnants of them were just discovered about 100 years ago in the 1920s. And up until then, because most big archaeologists in the 17 and 1800s were European, most archaeologists up until 100 years ago believed that the Mesopotamian cities were the oldest in the world. And that implies a lot of kind of cultural tunnel vision. It's basically European archaeologists and historians looking at Mesopotamia and thinking it's the oldest and the greatest because that's the beginning of kind of Western civilization. Does that make sense? Cities grow up in Mesopotamia and then they move further west into Egypt and Greece and then Rome, and that's kind of the beginning of European history. Does it make sense?
Which city was the first one?
They pop up almost right around the same time as each other. I mean, within just years. So they're just in not the same place, but very close to each other at a very similar timeline, which fascinates historians. But a lot of these European-centric archaeologists, when these places are uncovered in the 1920s, they don't want to believe it. To think that a non-European civilization would have been older by hundreds and hundreds of years than Mesopotamia. A lot of these Eurocentric people, they didn't want to believe it and tried to prove that these cities were, a fake, or that they were older or younger than they pop up later than the archaeologists said. But it's well proven now that these two cities are the oldest large-scale human settlements that we know of even today. Does that make sense? Question?
Isn't Wasn't that you talking about Mesopotamia? I think it's the first day. Isn't that called like the agricultural revolution or something like that?
Yeah, that's where.
So it
That's
has to
where the
start
art.
right here.
Yeah, it starts here first.
Because that's like, okay.
And a lot of people, some Eurocentric, you can almost call them racist, still don't want to admit it today. They want to see Europe as the center of the world.
Did they have the same technology as Mesopotamia in terms of?
Well, yeah, similar technology. They start first to build the big buildings with, especially really thick walls. And they start the trading routes and building roads and irrigation systems before Mesopotamia really gets going.
Were they in contact with Mesopotamia?
Eventually, but not at their start.
I'll just say because maybe they got there.
That's what a lot of European archaeologists tried to argue, but I mean, there are hundreds of years.
Well, no, I'm saying the
Before
other way
Mesopotamia.
around, that Mesopotamia got their technology.
Yeah, that seems very possible because these two start out in this area, this Indus River Valley, but they expand pretty quickly. No, I'll have a better map. But we know that they start building trade routes and start making contact, not with just Mesopotamia, but all the way down into the Arabian Peninsula. Let's see if I can find a better map. We know that these Indian traders, Mesopotamia is about here. They don't just go to Mesopotamia. They go down into the Arabian Peninsula. There's even stories of them going down to Anatolia. So they're spreading far and wide. And good ideas can spread like that real quick when they're useful.
What about the religion?
Religious ideas for them seem to be polytheistic. They believe in many gods. They seem to have a kind of worship of fertility, having babies, basically. So a lot of the religious icons that we find are like female characters that have big breasts, often carrying children. And like this one, male characters that seem like big and strong. They often have big beards, which we think was probably an indication to them of like great manliness or something like that. If you go just by the icons that they leave behind, it seems to be a kind of sexually divided society where women have their roles and men have their roles.
But they were not like in the war, right? They were just trading.
That is controversial. Historians and archaeologists still argue about that. Number one, it appears that they are contacting other places, so they're looking for people to trade with. That seems to be why they're traveling around. And they don't really conquer other places to control them, so that's the evidence on the side that they are not warlike. They're not looking for conquest. They're not looking for battle. But they also build their walls in their home cities extremely thick. I mean, sometimes these walls are like 40 feet thick, a wall. So that indicates to some people that they are warlike, or they're at least afraid of being attacked, because why else would you build a wall that big? And specifically to guard certain buildings.
Now, these cities they existed before the Silk Road trade, or after?
Oh, way before. There is no Silk Road really at this point.
And that's the Middle Eastern, right? Once it started.
That's where it gets started, but it'll eventually go all the way to China. So we'll get to that later tonight as it starts to emerge.
Wasn't it China for the first one?
Well, the Silk Road is a series of trade routes that are kind of informally linked. So there's like a part in China where the Chinese are trading amongst themselves, and there's a part in northern India, and over hundreds and hundreds of years, traders kind of go between. And I mean, it's not a paved road or anything. It's just like a series of way stations where people can stop as they try to go from one place to another. So it's like
nomadic tribes trading kind of thing.
Not always nomadic. Sometimes they have a home in one place or the other, but they're often traveling, and they travel the route so consistently that they learn where to go. They learn the landmarks and whatnot. But it's not a formal road. It's just this kind of path that people continue to follow, and over time it gets built up and built up and built up to a point where it does become a highway system eventually. But that takes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's a slow evolution. Does it make sense? And eventually it goes all the way into Greece. So it's a long series of trading routes.
What were they planning?
What were they planning? The two
Yeah.
cities? Or?
No, like planting.
Oh,
It was like the main state.
one of the giant ones we know that they plant is cotton. They become the first human civilization that we know of to make cotton clothing. Probably because cotton is a very light kind of fabric once you make it into clothes. So it's really good in high heat and high humid climates, high humidity. Just because the fabric breathes real well, it allows air in. So if most of the clothing that you're probably wearing right now is made out of cotton, or at least half of it. If you look on the tag, it probably says like 50 or 60% cotton. Other societies make other kinds of clothes, especially in colder climates that are much heavier, don't breathe as well because they don't want that cold air, hitting them because it kills you. So a lot of them will develop woolen clothing made out of wool. Which, if you've ever worn a wool jacket or anything, it's heavy. It's not something you want to wear in 110 degrees.
And good perfumes and clothes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially here.
Yeah. And they'll also become eventually by after year zero, become famous for spices and salts and all kinds of things to try to preserve meat especially. So yeah, those are their big staple crops, at least at first. And the reason we make cotton clothing is because if you've ever been to India, especially northern India, it's extremely humid. It's unbelievably humid. Talking 130 degrees compared to what we're living with now. You guys ever been in a humid climate? Like Texas. Yeah, Texas gets it. The Midwest or the South in the United States. 80 degrees in that kind of high humidity is really pretty unbearable.
America.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah, living in a desert area is much, much different. You hear it all the time by people who visit, say, Southern California, or if you go out to like Arizona or Las Vegas or something, people always say, well, it's 100 degrees, but it's a dry heat.
Yeah, it's way better.
Which, if you've ever been to the Midwest in the summertime, it's 80 degrees and 90% humidity, and you feel like you're going to die. Maybe that's just me because I grew up here, and I'm just used to very low humidity. I get in a humid place, and I just don't want to live anymore. Yeah. God, the heat never goes away. You walk outside at 1 a.m. and that heat is still there. Whereas living out in the desert, you walk outside at 1 a.m. and you at least get a cool breeze. Yeah. I have family in the Midwest, and they ever come out to Los Angeles. They love once the sun goes down and cools off, and they say, "Wow, it's beautiful." Yes, it is. That's why I don't live in the Midwest. Yeah, I can't do the humidity. But this place has extreme humidity today. People die from it. Literally, it's so humid that people that are susceptible, like elderly people, we're talking hundreds of people are dying in northern India when it gets real hot in the summertime. Does that make sense? Of course, they have a much bigger population than the United States, about 4 times as many people. But yeah, that's most likely why they make the cotton clothing, just to survive that humidity. Does anyone ever been to India? And, well, especially the wealthier people, they always have tile floor in their homes because it's cool. Nice and cold in the summertime. Other questions about these cities? Nope. Let's see. Well, we know that they create specialized labor because we have the artifacts of that kind of specialized labor. They have stamps, which is interesting on several levels. Number one, someone is getting paid to make these stamps out of some kind of rock, to literally carve the images. And number two, stamps are really important for the ancient world. Because if you want to write a secret message on a piece of paper and put it in an envelope, and you want to make sure that it gets to the person that you want to send it to, and it's kept secret, which means no one opens it up and reads it for themselves, you put a stamp on it. Does that make sense? Like if on your transcripts, if you ever get transcripts from Chafee, they'll put a stamp right on the envelope that says if this stamp is damaged or the seal is broken, that means that someone has gotten into the transcript and maybe messed with it. You ever seen that? Or on important letters, sometimes people will sign their name along the seal just to make sure it gets to wherever it's going without being opened. Or if it's open, that whoever receives it knows that it was opened. Does that make sense? That implies that not only are they writing a lot, but they have really important secret messages that they want to send back and forth, which implies to us some kind of like there's an elite society that are governing the place, and they have secret messages. We might have big families that are wealthy and they're moving money around. Those are the kind of messages they want to keep hidden. So and we find hundreds and hundreds of these different kinds of stamps, which indicates to us that there's a lot of specialized labor. There's a rich and a poor in society. Does that make sense? So it's a highly developed society. Archaeologists estimate that each of these cities at their height, around 2500 or so BCE, so 1,000 years into their existence, probably have about 200,000 people living in each city, which is a large city, especially in the ancient world. And to have that kind of size, you need roads, you need buildings, you need some kind of water supply, irrigation, food distribution systems, all kinds of things just to keep that many people alive. Does that make sense? All right, so they are advancing civilization very quickly, and we've already gone over the religious stuff. All right, they go into a collapse. We don't exactly know why. Around the year 1900 BCE or so, those two cities are depopulated for one reason or another. There's still argument amongst historians about how and why that happened. Historians do not agree on how that happened, so they're still arguing with each other. One of the more reliable theories that has a lot of evidence behind it is that perhaps they went through some kind of climate change where perhaps the mountains were not getting cold enough to suck in the monsoonal storms and keep them there for a long time. Perhaps the monsoons came in but then left real quick, so they didn't get as much yearly rainfall as they were used to. If they don't have as much fresh water, that means that the soil is not as good as it used to be. So it's not producing as much food as it used to. So you have gigantic populations and suddenly a food shortage, which may have inspired people to leave those cities and go further inland or go somewhere else to try to find better land to farm. Does that make sense? But again, that's just one theory amongst many. It's one of the more famous theories out there about those two cities. But to emphasize again, we don't know exactly why they disappeared. We just know that they did. And really at almost the same moment in time. And right when those cities become depopulated is when the last remnants of the European so-called Aryans that we talked about before, moving down through Greece and down through Persia, the very last remnants of that mass migration start coming into northern India right after those cities have depopulated. Question?
So when you say were they like super hostile?
Yep. And we know that from the native Indian writings, they start writing stuff down about who are these lighter-skinned, fierce warrior types of people that are coming and attacking us all the time. They don't know where these people came from.
Did they have like horses too?
They had horses and chariots and steel, or not steel, but advanced metal weapons.
So this were Julius Caesar's troops.
Say again?
Were they Caesar's troops or
No.
Alexander's?
Oh, this is long before Caesar.
Well, I'm confusing, but yeah.
Yeah, this is 1,500 years before Caesar.
So when they went to Persia, was that just a migration, or was that kind of like an invasion too?
When the Aryans went into
Yeah.
Persia, they don't conquer Persia, right?
So they just had just regular people just go in there and just start living in Persia.
Yeah.
And over here they actually
Yeah, they're basically refugees from Europe. But here they're attacking. And we know that pretty clearly, or we think that pretty clearly at least. I don't want to say no with all absolute power. We believe that the Aryans came in and started attacking because there's a huge amount of evidence for it. Number one, archaeologists start finding a lot of foreign weapons in the place suddenly. Number two, the Indians themselves are writing to each other about how they're being attacked and what they should do to defend themselves. And number three, they are conquered. The Aryans come in and they start setting up basically like little provinces under their own control. So they actually take over the governments in northern India and start setting up their own governments. The Aryans, though, don't come in as a unified group and conquer the place and turn it into like one giant unified Aryan empire. That doesn't happen. Basically, the Aryans come in and they conquer one piece after another, and then the Aryans start attacking each other. So you have probably 40 or 50 different individual princes in different parts of northern India that are of Aryan descent, and they're attacking each other, trying to gain land. So they are not unified at all. They generally become known as the Rajas. A Raja is like a prince of a certain small little local territory, and is often in competition against the neighboring Rajas from other places. And sometimes they're friends, but they're usually not. They at least distrust each other, and they're constantly fighting against each other. So Aryan control over northern India is extremely fragmented. It's just all split up. It's a big mess. Does that make sense? Their big problem, though, outside of their own infighting, their own struggles for power amongst themselves, one of their big problems is that they're conquering a totally foreign culture, foreign civilization. And they knew it, and the people they conquered knew it. So they have to figure out some way of convincing the Indian civilization to accept being conquered by this outside force. And they get very tricky with it. They basically figured out one of the best ways to convince a people to be calm and docile and accept being conquered is to put those ideas into religious messages. So the Aryans come in with their own religious ideas. They make contact with the Indians who already had their own religious ideas. And what the Aryans do is kind of meld their two religions together to create this new kind of amalgam religious movement. And they spread it far and wide throughout their holdings. And they build religious buildings, they set up infrastructure, and they set up hymns, basically religious songs that worshippers would sing during their ceremonies. And the hymns were called Vedas under this Aryan leadership. And the Vedas were so powerful that the whole movement becomes known as the Vedic movement, the Vedic religion. And these Rajas realize that if people are singing the same song over and over and over again, day after day, that if you can get political messages in there about being subservient and not rocking the boat, not starting revolutions, not even complaining about the government, if people sing that stuff day after day, then you get your message into their brains every day. Does that make sense? And a lot of people, if you just tell them the same thing over and over again, day after day after day, they'll start to believe it, almost no matter what the message is. They hear it repetitively, especially from a kind of authority symbol. They'll believe it no matter how ridiculous the message might be. Does that make sense? Question?
The Vedas, are they're Aryan?
The Vedas are the songs.
Oh, the Vedas are the songs.
Yeah, the hymns.
Oh,
as
duh.
you would think of them in, I don't know, Christianity.
So a lot of the song might be mostly religious based, but then there's a little line in there about, following orders from those that are higher up than you in the hierarchy. And it's an extremely successful system for not just religious control, but social control, to convince these people to accept being conquered and controlled by a foreign force. So for the long term, the main ideas that start to emerge out of these religious structures are, number one, reincarnation. The idea that you live this life, and when you die, when your body dies, your spirit, your soul, whatever you want to call it, your kind of essence, is sent into a new body and you're born again. So you're reincarnated, you're recycled into another life. And it seems that a lot of the native Indian people are already believing in this kind of thing. And so the Aryans are really kind of taking advantage of that. And the reincarnation cycle coming out of this Vedic tradition basically believes that you're reincarnated forever, one life after another for eternity. So they start looking at life as a cycle. You're born, you grow up, you get old, you die, then you're born, you just keep doing it over and over and over and over again. Does that make sense? And the other major idea that comes out is this kind of social class system, that there's an upper class and a middle class and a low class, and that each group has certain jobs it's supposed to do.
It's like a caste system.
Yeah, this is kind of early beginning of a caste system.
They have that right now in India.
Yeah, they have it now, but this is where it gets going. It's not as rigid as it is now. It's more kind of theoretical. If you're born into this kind of group, you should do these things in life. These are your kind of your jobs assigned by the gods. But it's very kind of, it's not rigidly enforced. You can kind of move around. You can negotiate the limits of that kind of stuff. But the general idea is you're born into a certain class, you're supposed to do certain kind of jobs, certain kind of work in your life. And if you do those jobs and you do them well and you don't complain, then you can get rewarded in your next life by being reincarnated up a higher level. Does that make sense? So if you're born into the working class and you're a farmer, and you do a good job at it, you don't complain, you don't start revolutions or anything, and then you get old and you die, you can be reincarnated up into the rich class, the landowner class, or up into a government, or who knows, something better. Does that make sense? So you get a reward for doing your job and not rocking the boat. Does that make sense? Questions about that at all? Yeah.
So if you're rich, there wasn't any expectation like on you, so it doesn't work the opposite way.
It does work the opposite way too. If you're born into the upper class, the powerful class, and you're corrupt, or you steal, or you kill people, or you're just not a nice person, you can get reincarnated down.
Okay.
Then you have to be a farmer the next time. So yeah, there's a punishment of it too. And the idea is, over eternity, life after life, you kind of go up and down the scale according to your kind of moral actions in this life. So there's pressure. And a lot of historians think, a lot of this is created by the government to convince people to do what they're supposed to and just be quiet about it and don't start revolts, don't start complaints, just follow orders. Does that make sense? Can be a very useful thing for governments, right? Governments usually don't want people running around screaming about how bad the government is, how corrupt the leaders are, and how they should be overthrown. Does that make sense? Yeah, they usually want stability. And you hear the U.S. government talk about that all the time, right? We want stability. We want stability all around the world. Stability, stability. It's usually what the people in power always want. They want things to remain the same. Why? Because they're in power. They're the one in control. Usually the people on the lower rungs of society that don't really want this stability so much. Does that make sense? Because if you're poor, why do you support stability? It's not doing good for you. So revolts and complaint usually comes from below, right? Which is perfectly logical. But usually things that governments and big companies and all kinds of things are going to try to clamp down on as much as possible. Questions about anything on this slide? Nope. All good? Alrighty. All right, so to get into what starts to emerge as the caste system, and to do it fairly simply, we'll talk about just a few kind of levels. The upper class are called the Kshatriya. This is the class of people who kind of run society. The administrators, the government leaders, the warriors in the armies, the police forces, the religious leaders that are often called the Brahmins, because they, go to the gods and try to get the favor of the gods for, keep the hurricanes away and keep the harvest going good and all that kind of stuff. So they're the upper class, the people that are kind of in charge, have big, important responsibilities for all of society. All right. And the Vaishya are the kind of average working class, the average laborers, the farmers, people who raise animals for slaughter. So they're the general food producers. Small level merchants, people that own businesses that move goods around from one place to another, buying and selling, importing and exporting. Often what we call artisans, which are workers that have like a special skill, like a blacksmith or a carpenter or a woodworker.
Labor.
Yeah, it's manual labor still, like farming, but you have to be taught that skill over many years to become like a master carpenter, right? But this middle group are the kind of the workforce in society. They do the manual, the physical labor that society depends on. And then you have a third class called the Shudra. They do the worst jobs in society. They do like the sanitation work. They do the burials. They deal with dead bodies. They do like the most disgusting jobs in society. So they're doing manual labor also, but a kind of almost insulting kind of labor that the farmers and the master craftsmen don't want to do. And a lot of the Shudra are often POWs, prisoners of war. When one group attacks another and they take prisoners from the battlefield, they put them into their lower class and make them into the worst workers in society. So this is a very early version of the caste system. The caste system is not as rigid as it would later be. It's not really formalized until around the 400s BCE. So it goes on for 1,500 years or so. It's negotiable. You can sometimes move from one caste to another, even in your lifetime. Like if you're a real successful farmer, you can move into the higher class and become a landowner. Later on, that won't really be possible. If you're born after the 400s BCE, if you're born into one of these, you're kind of forced by government to stay in that level, and by a massive social pressure. So if you're born into like the Kshatriya group, that level, and you fall in love and want to marry someone from the Vaishya group, your family just won't allow it. And they'll punish you for it. So that it becomes much more kind of heavily hierarchical, and you can't really cross those borders anymore after the 400s BCE. But another thing to remember about the early caste system, and even a big part of it today, is that especially the upper groups look down on the lower groups, right? But they realize that all groups are important because they all have their designated jobs and roles in society. No one group can survive without the other two. It's just not going to work. So there's some amount of respect for the different groups because even if I'm in the Kshatriya and I'm a, a police captain or something, I still rely on the farmers, because if they go away, I'm not going to get any food and I'm going to die. So there's a realization that they depend on each other. There's interdependence amongst the groups, even after they're hardened to the point where if you're born in one group, you can never really get out of that group until you're reincarnated and hopefully you're born to the next higher level. Does that make sense? And this is over time, gets extremely complex. I mean, there's going to be subgroups and subgroups of subgroups, and today the caste system is just has hundreds of different groups. So I just use these three as a kind of keep it simple.
So what if there were? Because I know they had a caste system in the Americas as well when the first Europeans came to Latin America.
Yeah.
But that was racially biased. Now, were the Aryans part of the caste system?
Oh yeah, they're the Kshatriya. They set themselves up. Yeah. Just as, when say the Spanish come into what is today Mexico, the Spanish don't set themselves up as the Shudra. No, they set themselves up as the landowners and administrators and the people in charge of things, and the people they conquer are put into the lower classes to do the menial labor. You can... a lot of societies, especially older societies in the ancient world, developed these kind of caste systems, different social groups, and it becomes impermissible to marry someone below your status, basically.
So that originally comes from India, because the Spaniards kind of imposed it in Latin America.
Yeah, but how much the Spanish knew about the Indian caste system by the time the Spanish started doing it in Latin America is iffy. Developing different social classes seems to be something that people almost naturally do in big civilizations. And you can trace it in China, even though they don't have much contact with this for a long time. And you can trace it amongst Native American groups who never had any contact with Indians in Asia. So it seems to be something that people do to organize their societies, or something that the people in charge do to organize society for their own control. So the big word caste system is mostly applied to India, but it's been replicated. And you can argue it's still replicated today. What would happen if someone born into a millionaire family wants to marry a poor person? Is that really going to happen? Will the parents allow it?
So pretty much the caste system was found by India. It's different levels of society.
Yeah, and eventually rigidly enforced by government. But that's a long evolution to get to that point. But look around just in this city, in Fontana. You go down to the southern end of Fontana and take a look around just your neighborhood there, right? And just get in a car and take, one of the major boulevards and just start driving north. You see changes, right? By the time you get up into way northern Fontana, up into the foothills, you can just see it. You can see the size of the roads, how clean the streets are, how big the houses are, the expense of the cars that are driving around in different areas. You ever notice this? You can see those changes street by street by street. So do we live in a caste system today in the United States that's supposed to be completely free and you can do whatever you want?
I think you do.
Yeah. I'd argue that cities are economically segregated to the point, and you get into some really wealthy areas, you can't even drive on their streets because they put up fences everywhere and they have armed guards patrolling their houses. Yeah. These gated communities that you can't even access unless you have their special ID card, or you can prove that you live there or something.
Perfect.
Yeah. So is this stuff still going on? I think it's an open question, and you're free to disagree with me. You think everything is absolutely, completely equal from birth? All right. And to go further into some of their religious ideas, some terminology about this, especially with reincarnation. The spiritual core that you have, what in Christianity they call a soul, in India is called samsara. So this is like your essence, your individuality that survives the death of the body and goes on and becomes reincarnated into other bodies. So when you die, they believe, your body ends and is done and is dead, but your spiritual core like survives leaving that body and basically like becomes one with the internal universe for a little while and then is reincarnated into another body. Does it make sense? All right. Dharma is how many of those jobs you actually did well in your life that you just ended. So did you do a good job, basically? Did you do what you were supposed to? So that's what Dharma generally means.
Can you go back?
Go back.
Yeah.
Right here? Good? Good with Dharma?
Yeah.
All right. And the big one that you've probably heard of in the United States is called karma. That is the kind of the weight of guilt that your spirit, your essence, carries from one life to another. And in theory, if you have a lot of negative karma, you have a lot of guilt for the things that you just did in your past life, when you're reincarnated, that will drag you down to be reincarnated into a lower class. So textbooks will call it like a spiritual fate when you're transitioning from one life to another.
So is this before Shiva and those gods?
There's all kinds of those ideas already running around. There's all kinds of different gods in northern India. And I don't know the history of all those gods well enough to say when Shiva came about and what its relation is to the Aryans or this whole Vedic movement or all these ideas. I just don't know the timeline of those gods well enough to even answer that.
I have a question. So,
Yeah.
with regard to how they thought about the reincarnation, so once they got into contact with other people, did they look at it like in a nutshell, like you could only be reborn into Indian society where their caste system is set up like that?
Well, that's a big question. Can you be reborn as a Mesopotamian or a Greek or something like that?
Or it wouldn't apply?
I don't know. I have to, that's a big research question. That's what historians call a research question. What did people believe about the possibilities of reincarnation in like different eras of Indian history, and do those beliefs change over time as they're making contact with more and more people around the world? I don't know. That would take a lot of research to find out. I imagine that some historian out there has asked that question already and written books on it, or at least articles. But I just don't study India enough and keep up with the stuff that historians write on India to answer it. I don't know. It's an interesting question. What happens if you fulfill all your duties here in India, but then you get born in Greece? How's that going to help you? What does that mean? But the definitions of, one big question is, if you're born into the Shudra level, why not rise up and start revolution? You're already at the bottom. What else can happen? But the caste system gets expanded so that even if you're in the lowest of the low in human society, and you're still revolting and doing bad things, then eventually they'll start to believe that you can be reincarnated into a cow or goat or something like that. Does it make sense? So you can still be punished down into the animal level, and eventually they'll create this whole kind of ladder of what's the best animal to be. They get into what animal is better. And they take it all the way down to like the level of a fruit fly. So if you're like a really bad cat or a really bad dog or something, you can be reincarnated down into a bumblebee. It just gets more and more complex over time, as religions generally tend to do. Does it make sense? And my question for that is, well, once you get to fruit fly level, I mean, what kind of good moral choices are you making as a fruit fly that can kind of get you reincarnated back up to like dog level? But I have a lot of these funny questions about religions, quite honestly. They just engender interesting questions. Does it make sense? Yeah. Other questions? Nope. Moving on. All right. Well, as we get into the 500s BCE, these Rajas have been fighting each other for a long time. And the next big thing that happens in the 500s is Cyrus the Great starts taking over Persia and start launching all his conquests that we've talked about before. And one thing we didn't really talk about when we went over the Persian Empire is that the Persians actually attack further east and start conquering major northern Indian communities, major cities.
So I'm confused. I thought the Aryans were attacking them, or Cyrus the Great's people.
Nope.
So it's a whole different group of Europeans attacking.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Aryans are like these giant migrant groups that just go to one place after another. Like a lot of them stop off in Greece and start building up Greek civilization again, right? Some of them make it into Egypt, what we on this map is called Palestine. Some of them make it all the way into Persia and hang out there. The very last remnants of them that didn't stop off anywhere else, they make it into northern India and become the Rajas. So they're not Persian. They're from Europe. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. And in the 500s BCE, Cyrus from Persia starts attacking them and conquering their holdings, their territories in northern India. Does that make sense? So you get a Persian invasion and conquest where now big chunks of northern India become part of the Persian Empire, that massive like superstate, superpower of the ancient world. Does that make sense? And that really brings India back into contact with a lot of the other civilizations we've already talked about, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Persia, and connects them to what is becoming a kind of normal trade route that connects all these ancient civilizations. Does that make sense? So it kind of opens India back up to having travelers coming from Persia and all over this area back into India. And so there's a lot of kind of interplay, a lot of exchange under the Persian control. Does it make sense? But the Persians don't keep control of India for very long, because what happens after Cyrus?
Collapse.
No. Alexander comes through and conquers the Persian Empire, and the last kind of remnants as he and his armies are wandering around, they go far east into India, and that's the last places he conquered before he died. So by the 330s or so BCE, now parts of northern India are part of this giant Greek empire that Alexander built. And once Alexander died, much like the rest of his empire, some northern Indian people were put in charge of kind of controlling that province of this Greek empire. And once Alexander died, they just kind of start taking control and start an independence movement. And they are one of many areas that Alexander's empire crumbles pretty quickly after his death. And the Egypt start governing themselves. The Persians start governing themselves. and the northern Indians start governing themselves. Does that make sense? So they've been conquered a couple more times, but at the end of it, they're regaining their independence. And it's a fairly chaotic time after the Greeks are kicked out. You have, again, about 40 or 50 different local princes and rulers and rajas, or whatever they're calling themselves, in northern India, and they're fighting each other. And right around the year 300 or so, BCE, one of these guys, named Maurya, starts off in the far east along the Ganges, and he is the biggest success story of these kind of, I guess you call them Indian civil wars. And he starts conquering his neighbors, getting control of more land, more population, more money, more trade routes. And from there, it just expands and expands and expands right across northern India, and builds, through his lifetime, what becomes known as the Mauryan Empire. Which becomes the first unified Indian empire in India's, really, its whole history, going all the way back to the first cities. The first cities were independent of each other.
Oh, they were not linked.
Yeah, they weren't linked together. There was no common government.
They had armies.
Well, they had armies, but neither side could gain the upper hand over their enemies. This guy does. So all this area up here in this kind of, I don't know, I guess orangish territory, that's all his holdings. It's his empire, and he's king of the whole thing. Question.
Was he Aryan?
I don't think so.
They don't look Aryan to me.
Did they like intermarry to like make things go easy?
Well, that's one of his strategies of getting territory, is to marry into the royal families of the areas he's trying to conquer. It's a political deal.
When the Aryans came and started that whole, well, not they didn't start it, but the whole religion thing, it set themselves up as whatever they call it. However you say that.
Mm-hmm.
Do they intermarry like the local population?
That's
So it
a
becomes like-
common political deal to make in the ancient world and today. So royal families do that almost constantly. Like if they want a peace treaty with someone they've been fighting, they marry a couple of their kids together and hope that keeps the peace.
Now they're in-laws.
Yeah, he's married into the system, right? That's what powerful people do, and they still do
The reason I
today.
ask is because when they set up the whole system, so that means it wasn't all just the people that conquered. There was a lot of the past like leadership that was a part of that.
Yeah,
past.
and you have to figure out how to, number one, convince them to stop fighting, and number two, convince them to be peaceful. Because if you go in and take all their land, they're going to fight to the death. They want to be rich, and they'll fight for it. So you have to figure some way of making a deal with them, and a lot of times intermarriage is a part of that. Give them some kind of assurance that they're not going to be attacked anymore. Bring them into the ruling system. That's the Mauryan Empire, and it was a gigantic deal in northern India, especially at the time. And it goes on beyond his lifetime, specifically because it's the one giant unifying empire of all of northern India that has ever been seen to that point. That is of a at least fairly native Indian background. It's not the Greeks or the Persians, whoever else coming in and taking over. It's them doing it themselves. Does that make sense? So he's viewed as a native king. As he got older, he retired from the throne. He doesn't, serve his entire life and die on the throne. He retires. And he goes off to study religious ideas because he apparently felt guilty for all the people he killed in, conquering all this land in the first place. And the story goes that he actually dies of starvation because he was meditating so much. He just stopped eating. when he retired, he didn't designate any one person to take over his power. So there's a struggle, there's a civil war amongst many different parts of his family to determine who the next king is going to be. And the next guy in line is actually his grandson, named Ashoka. And he eventually wins the civil war against his own brothers and cousins and other family members, and has to have many of them killed in order to solidify his rule. And he's a pretty young and ambitious type of guy. And there's many, many statues of Ashoka as an adult throughout India that we've uncovered. His imperial symbol, his symbol of his reign, is the lion. So you see those images all over the place also. And he didn't want to stop there. Oops. There we go. He wants to control the rest of India. His grandfather only conquered the northern part. Ashoka wants to conquer the whole thing. So he launches massive invasions, especially going south into this middle area, this desert called the Deccan Plateau. And he launches extremely brutal invasions and sometimes massacres entire cities to teach others to not fight back.
So he wants to control all Africa? Or
No, India.
India.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And he almost gets there. He doesn't get to the very southern tip, and the island just south of there called Sri Lanka. But he goes through the Deccan Plateau and just massacres huge amounts of people, and he builds up armies the size of which had never been seen in India before. So he's a gigantic warlord. And when the conquests were complete, he also renounced violence and seemed to feel extraordinarily guilty for all the pain and misery he had caused to the people. He renounces violence completely and converts to Buddhism, which is a rising religious movement that we'll talk more about later. And completely changes his mind in what government should be and what it should do. So he never launches another war again, and keeps control over his conquest by building a good government that serves its people to make it popular. Instead of forcing them to accept his rule, he wants to convince them that his government is a better alternative than anything else possible, and devotes the rest of his life to serving his people in the best way that he can think of, and hires scholars from all over the known world to bring them into India and study all kinds of ideas about how to make government better and to improve the lives of the people. So he builds massive amounts of hospitals and irrigation systems and roads and all kinds of things. So he starts off as a very violent, intimidating force and goes through a major transition in his own life. And I have a short video to show you that emphasizes this. Okay, so his ideas become so central to their thoughts on governance that the independent India after World War II take up one of his symbols as their national symbol and put on their flag. The problem, though, is that he doesn't live forever like most people. He gets old and he dies. And like many governments throughout human history, the inheritors become increasingly corrupt down through a few generations. So the government in his lifetime is really good and serves the people. The next generation a little bit worse. The next generation a little bit worse. And eventually the whole thing starts to fall apart. And the last of the Mauryan emperors is assassinated by his own generals. And that opens the door for another group to invade. This one will set up what it calls the Kushan Empire. They will actually attack down from modern-day Afghanistan, down from the mountains, and invade northern India and conquer the big cities one after another around 50 BCE. And they'll stay around for about 300 years. So they really take over after the Mauryans. But this is a foreign invasion. This is a foreign group, foreign occupation. One of the biggest things that the Kushans do in their 300 years in power in India is to really continue connecting, especially northern India, to the emerging series of trade networks that on this map is called the Silk Road. And around the year zero, that is just starting to emerge as a consistent trade route going from the Mediterranean coastline in Anatolia all the way across through Persia, through Mesopotamia, just around northern India, north of the big mountain ranges, but eventually all the way to China. And the Kushans see that happening, so they develop trade routes that go up through the mountains to connect to it and really connect India to the rest of the known world at that time, the big civilizations that we're going to focus on in this semester. So the Kushans start in 50 BCE, around there in India, and then go to zero, and then go 240 years beyond year zero. So it'd be like 240 AD. So they're around for quite a long time.